Without further ado, I bring you the history of the pandemics. I've been doing this in my spare time.
The earliest recorded pandemic happened during the Peloponnesian War, and as much as 2/3 of the world's population died. The ridiculous symptoms included fever, unstoppable thirst, bloody throat, and bloody tongue.
Give me a kiss.
Gross. Many folks nowadays think it was actually typhoid fever, and it was a significant factor in the defeat of Athens by the Spartans. No, not Gerard Butler type Spartan, a real Spartan. And then there's Pericles, Athens' greatest general. He and all of his sons died from typhoid fever. 65 AD. The Antonine Plague was probably an early appearance of smallpox, and it began with the Huns. The Huns were nomadic warriors who completely terrorized Europe and the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. The Huns infected the Germans, then the Germans passed it to the Romans, and then the Roman troops spread it throughout the entire empire. The Antonine Plague continued to f*** it up until about 180 AD, claiming Emperor Marcus Aurelius as one of its victims. 541 AD, the Justinian Plague. This plague changed the course of Palestine and the Byzantine Empire. It's also credited with creating the most apocalyptic atmosphere that created Christianity. Recurrences over the next 2 centuries eventually killed about 50 million people, or 26% of the world's population. It is believed to be the first significant appearance of the bubonic plague, later known today as Black Death, which was carried by rats, who then gave it to the fleas, and the fleas gave it to the humans and everyone else. Research most recently indicated the pathogen responsible for Black Death may have existed in Europe as early as 3000 BC. Many folks think the nursery rhyme Ring Around the Rosie was actually written about Black Death.
Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.
1350, Black Death continues. Dead bodies were everywhere. They covered the streets and remained rotting on the ground for weeks at a time. The stench was constant in most European cities. The plague caused panic and a fury of anti-Semitic massacres after a rumor spread that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells in towns throughout Germany and France. One of the worst massacres of Jews during Black Death, February 1349, Valentine's Day. 2,000 Jewish people were burned alive. And then in the spring, 3,000 Jews defended themselves against Christians, but were overcome and then slaughtered. Black Death claimed 200 million lives in just 4 years. England and France were so fucked up by this plague that they called a truce to their war. The Vikings, with their sexy leather and intricate braided hair, lost strength to wage battle, and their exploration of North America was halted. And despite what we were taught in school, yes, they were indeed here before Amerigo Vespucci or Christopher Columbus, for fuck's sake. Physicians of the time developed bloodletting and boil lancing and other really dumb superstitious practices like burning herbs and bathing in rosewater. The plague never really ended. It continued on and returned years later. In the port town of Ragusa, sailors were held on their ships for 30 days, which became known as the Trentino. And as time went on, the Venetians increased that isolation to 40 days, or a quarantino, which was the origin of our modern-day quarantine that we still practice today. 1492, Columbus set sail, bringing smallpox, measles, and the bubonic plague to native populations. These diseases devastated the indigenous people, with as many as 90% dying throughout the North and South continents. Take, for instance, the Taino people, with a population of 60,000. By 1548, that population stood at less than 500. This scenario repeated itself throughout the Americas. In 1520, the Aztec Empire was destroyed by a smallpox infection. Yet, in China and India, there was documentation of what was described as a smallpox inoculation, or one of the first ever vaccines. It involved grinding up smallpox scabs and blowing that matter into folks' nostrils. It is difficult to pinpoint when this practice began, but some sources claim it dates back to as early as 200 BC. In 1760, the North American colonists gifted smallpox-contaminated blankets to Native Americans. This weaponizing of smallpox contributed to the death of some 56 million Native Americans. On the 6th of January, 1777, George Washington wrote to Dr. William Shippen Jr., ordering him to vaccinate all of the forces that came through Philadelphia. He explained that, quote, necessity not only authorizes but seems to require the measure, for should the disorder infect the army, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of our enemy. And who could forget these 3 Indian queens who modeled for a painting in 1806 promoting the smallpox vaccine? 1918. The Spanish flu infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, about 1/3 of our planet's population, including some 675,000 Americans. October of 1918 was often known as the deadliest month in American history, taking 195,000 lives. The public health director in Philly ignored doctors and decided to have a parade for the government war bonds anyway. 3 days later, every hospital bed was filled and the city was on the brink of collapse. Over 11,000 Philadelphia residents died in October 1918. Then, on the other side of our country in San Francisco, quote, mask slackers, coined by the press, would be fined $5 or even sent to jail if they were caught in public without a mask. They were charged with disturbing the peace. Wear your masks. Obey the city ordinance. Globally, the pandemic infected 1/3 of our planet's population and killed an estimated 50 million people by 1920. The combination of the flu and the war made many Americans afraid of what was out there. During this time, America saw a huge increase in the numbers of Ku Klux Klan, feeding on the fear of what was foreign. And at its peak in 1920, the Klan membership had exceeded 4 million people nationwide. The first ever recorded case of polio was in 1868, but it wasn't actually until the 1930s that we saw a rise in cases. The disease mainly affects children and sometimes leaves survivors with permanent disabilities. Death can result if the patient doesn't receive an artificial breathing apparatus, similar to the iron lung like we saw in The Big Lebowski.
That's him, dude. And a good day to you, sir!
God, I love Walter. It's likely that polio has plagued humans for thousands of years. An Egyptian carving from around 1400 BC shows a young man with a leg deformity similar to the one caused by polio. Even our 32nd president, FDR, contracted polio in 1921. The disease left him with both legs permanently paralyzed. By 1935, the nation had achieved some measure of recovery from the Depression. You've seen this photo a million times, I'm sure. And as a female photographer myself, I have to bring attention to Dorothea Lange, documentary photographer and photojournalist best known for her Depression-era work for the Farm Security Administration. And her pictures are known throughout time and space. All right, so back to Roosevelt. Roosevelt released a New Deal program, and the businessmen and bankers and Republicans were pissed. They hated his support of unions, and they made up ridiculous lies about FDR's family and even their dog. The unfazed Roosevelt responded with a new program called Social Security, which taxed the fuck out of the wealthy, put new controls over banks and public utilities, and included an enormous work relief program for the unemployed. Then, on October 28, 1956, Elvis decided to get the polio vaccine backstage at the Ed Sullivan Show.
You ain't nothing but...
The last case of polio in the U.S. was reported in 1979. Worldwide, vaccination efforts have greatly reduced the disease, although it is not yet completely eradicated. 1981. Since the first case of HIV/AIDS was reported in 1981, this virus, although rare, continues to be one of the most prevalent and deadliest pandemics worldwide. There were 1.7 million new cases of HIV reported in 2018. Almost 38 million people are still living with HIV, and 24.4 million of them are currently receiving medicines to treat HIV called antiretroviral therapy. 2019. The first reported case of COVID happened on November 17th, 2019, in the Hubei province of China, but it went unrecognized. Then, on January 20th, 2020, the CDC confirmed the first case of COVID in the US. As the virus ripped across the globe, over 6 million people had died that first year. The first vaccine shots were administered on December 14th, 2020, across the United States. a sure sign of hope for most Americans, but many were still hesitant to take the new mRNA vaccine. By 2021, COVID cases and deaths continued to rise as new variants of the virus emerged. Worldwide, over 5 billion people are vaccinated against the coronavirus. Yet, for whatever reason, some Americans still remain reluctant to get vaccinated. As of March 2022, the confirmed COVID death toll is over 6 million people worldwide. Today, infection rates are still steadily decreasing because of the vaccine, and it appears we might be moving into an endemic rather soon. But for the most part, endemic diseases are here to stay. The shift from pandemic to endemic will have a lot to do with us all adapting to the thought of living alongside COVID and not completely eradicating it. This look back throughout our history as a human race made me realize that history constantly repeats itself. If there is a lesson to be learned here from any of this madness, it's to learn from our past mistakes. But that question still stands. Will we?
Thank you for joining me in this 11 minutes, which took me 6 months. This is my little edit studio where the magic happened. Now I'm going to do a cooking show. Okay, bye.